A racist gang, thinking they've targeted an easy victim, destroys the home of a seemingly ordinary black man. What they don't know is that their victim is the most dangerous Navy SEAL, trained in the art of war. Now, the hunt is on, and the gang's time is running out. Before starting the story, quickly comment down from where in the world you are watching the video, and subscribe for more thrilling stories. It was a quiet night. The kind that made you feel like nothing could ever go wrong. The sky was dimming with the first signs of twilight, the kind of evening where the neighborhood felt almost peaceful, too peaceful. But that peace was about to be shattered. A group of thugs, led by a man named Jax, cruised down a well-maintained street of modest, middle-class homes. The smell of freshly cut grass lingered in the air, but Jax wasn't here for tranquility. His eyes, gleaming with a malicious anticipation, fixed on a particular house on the corner, a home that didn't deserve to be on his list, but had made the mistake of crossing his path. The house belonged to Marcus Wright, a black man who had spoken out against Jax's crew, disrupting their plans and embarrassing them in public. Jax's fingers drummed against the steering wheel of the van. He grinned, his teeth flashing in the rearview mirror. It was time to send a message. Time to remind everyone who ruled the streets. "We're going to make an example of him," he muttered under his breath. "A few Molotov cocktails will make sure he gets the point." With practiced ease, Jax pulled the van to the curb, just out of sight. His crew shuffled out, eager to get their hands dirty, while he retrieved the bottles of gasoline and rags from the back. The plan was simple: light up the house and watch it burn, make sure Marcus felt the full weight of their rage. Without hesitation, Jax hurled the first Molotov cocktail at the front porch. The glass shattered, and a fiery explosion erupted, sending sparks into the night air. The flames spread quickly, devouring the front door, licking the walls, and sending plumes of thick smoke curling into the sky. The rest of the crew followed suit, throwing bottle after bottle, laughing as the inferno grew. They reveled in the chaos they were creating, unaware of the consequences they had just unleashed. Inside the house, everything was eerily silent. The air was thick with smoke, but inside, there was no panic, no cries for help. No movement. The house was a scene of stillness, as if the fire outside had no power to penetrate its walls. The gang didn't know it, but their target hadn't even flinched. He hadn't called the police. Hell, he hadn't even moved from his spot in the back of the house. They assumed they had broken him. Destroyed him. After all, what kind of man would just sit there, letting his house burn down around him? What they didn't know was that Marcus Wright wasn't just any man. His eyes, cold and calculating, watched from the shadows. His face was impassive, his breathing steady. He could feel the heat from the flames, the growing roar of the fire outside, but it didn't faze him. The chaos outside only seemed to fuel the simmering anger inside him. Jax and his crew had no idea who they were dealing with. They had underestimated the man they targeted. Marcus wasn't some helpless civilian. He was a former Navy SEAL, a decorated veteran who had seen more destruction than they could imagine. He had been trained for moments like this. As the flames roared louder and the crew continued to laugh, Marcus's eyes narrowed. He was done being the victim. This night wasn't going to end with him running for cover. No, he was going to make them regret every single second they spent outside his door. It wasn't just a house they had set on fire. It was their own destruction. And it was only just beginning. The fire outside continued to rage, but Marcus remained unfazed, his mind working like clockwork. His training had taught him how to remain calm in the most intense situations. In the military, he'd had to make split-second decisions with lives on the line. Now, the stakes were personal, but the approach was the same. He wasn't going to run or hide, he was going to take action. Jax and his crew didn't even hear the sound of Marcus's footsteps, soft and purposeful as he moved through the house, each step bringing him closer to his enemies. His eyes flicked over his weapons, carefully chosen for a task like this. A few knives. A couple of pistols. But most important, his mind, sharp, prepared, and more lethal than any weapon. He knew they'd be cocky, underestimating him, thinking they had control. That would be their mistake. Outside, Jax laughed louder now, encouraging his crew to keep up the pressure. The fire had spread to the roof, and the whole house was an inferno. They were certain the job was done. But the heat on their faces was the first sign that something wasn't right. The night air shifted, and with it came the sharp sound of boots hitting pavement, a sound that was impossible to ignore. A few of Jax's crew turned toward the street, but it was too late. Marcus was already there, emerging from the shadows like a predator, moving with the precision and purpose of someone who had spent years learning how to hunt. The crew froze as they saw him, their mockery vanishing in the face of his calm, terrifying presence. Jax, still oblivious to the danger, sneered. "What's this? You think you're some hero?" he spat. "You're too late to save your house. It's already gone." Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. With one swift movement, he drew a knife from his belt and tossed it at one of the thugs, striking him in the leg. The man crumpled to the ground, screaming. The sound of his voice was drowned out by the roar of the fire, but it was enough to send a chill down the other's spines. Before Jax could react, Marcus was already moving again, quick, calculated, unstoppable. The next few seconds were a blur of motion. He disarmed one thug, sent another sprawling to the ground, and with a speed that left the rest of the crew paralyzed with fear, took out the ringleader. By the time the police arrived, they found a street still smoldering in the aftermath of the fire, but the only thing that had truly burned was Jax's pride. His gang lay scattered, some wounded, others tied up neatly in a way only a Navy SEAL could manage. Marcus stood over them, a quiet storm in human form. The house he'd loved was gone, but in its place, something much stronger had been forged. The night wasn't over, but for Jax and his crew, it would never be the same again. And as the sirens blared closer, Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady, cold. "You've made your statement. Now, let me make mine." Jax and his gang thought the job was done. After the destruction of Marcus's home, they had already moved on to their next target, feeling the high of their so-called victory. It was a small win, at least in their minds. The neighborhood had burned, but they'd left no room for regret. As they sat around a makeshift fire in a dim back alley, the heat from the flames seemed to mirror the heat of their satisfaction. Jax, grinning with his signature cocky smirk, cracked open a bottle of cheap whiskey and held it up in a mock salute. "Here's to us," he toasted, voice slurred. "We just put that guy in his place. A few more jobs like that, and we'll own this city." The rest of the gang laughed along, but the laughter was tinged with something else, uncertainty, maybe even a slight edge of doubt. Yet Jax, ever the leader, wasn't bothered. They had done what they came to do. The night was theirs. They were kings of this forgotten corner of the city. But slowly, the atmosphere began to shift. The kind of tension that crawls up your spine like cold fingers, without warning. It started small, an uncomfortable silence, but it spread like wildfire. The dark humor they had shared earlier, the jokes, the banter, it all started to feel hollow, like they were pretending to enjoy the victory they'd just won. The fire flickered in the wind, casting eerie, distorted shadows on the grimy walls around them. The sound of crackling embers seemed to amplify, drawing their attention to the night beyond the warmth of their small fire. And then, just as the wind shifted again, a muffled noise broke the stillness. It wasn't like the usual city sounds, the faint hum of traffic or the occasional shout from a faraway alley. This was different. It felt deliberate. A footfall. A pause. Another. "I thought you said no one was home," one of the gang members muttered nervously, glancing over his shoulder. His eyes darted to the shadows, but all he could make out was the creeping dark. He swore he heard something, footsteps, faint but distinct, coming closer. Jax waved it off, trying to dismiss the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. "It's nothing, just some homeless guy or a stray cat, calm down." His voice, usually steady, wavered slightly as he took another swig from the bottle. But despite his bravado, the creeping sense of unease grew. Something about the sound, it didn't belong. The others shuffled uncomfortably. One by one, their eyes kept darting around, scanning the alley's dark corners, their fingers twitching toward the weapons they had tucked into their jackets. The laughter that had once come so easily now seemed forced, thin. "I'm telling you, I heard something," another thug muttered, his voice low but edged with a palpable fear. His eyes narrowed into the night, trying to make sense of the sound. It wasn't just the steps, they were getting closer, more deliberate now, like someone knew exactly where they were. Jax, his smirk faltering, tried to brush it off. He looked down the alley, seeing only shadows. Relax. It's probably a damn stray dog. But even as he spoke, a cold sweat trickled down his back. His mind raced, trying to reason away the unease gnawing at him. Still, the sound continued to echo in the distance, growing closer and more rhythmic. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The laughter in the circle had stopped completely. The gang members were no longer looking at him for reassurance. Their eyes were wide, searching for the source of that ominous sound. They could feel it too. Then it happened. The unmistakable sound of a boot striking the pavement. Not too far off. One of the gang members jumped to his feet, his hand darting for the gun tucked beneath his coat. Someone's coming. Get ready. But before anyone could react, the air seemed to freeze, everything went still. The firelight cast long shadows as the flickering flames danced nervously. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness at the far end of the alley. Jax's heart skipped a beat. The man was tall, moving with the eerie calm of someone who had been in the dark for too long. His face was mostly hidden in shadow, but there was no mistaking the steely glint of eyes locked on them. It was Marcus. But Marcus wasn't just any man. He wasn't the helpless victim they thought they'd left behind. His steps were measured, purposeful, each one bringing him closer. The gang members froze, unsure whether to run or prepare for a fight. They had expected him to be broken, to be cowering in fear after what they'd done to his home. But instead, he was calm, collected, and deadly focused. Jax opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His bravado, his cocky arrogance, seemed to evaporate as Marcus drew nearer. The whiskey bottle in his hand felt strangely heavy now, like an anchor dragging him down. Jax, Marcus's voice broke through the silence, smooth, but carrying a weight that made the thug's blood run cold. You've made a mistake. The gang members backed up a step, but Marcus's eyes were fixed on Jax. He hadn't moved in the slightest. It was clear that he was the one who was in control now. You thought you could just burn me out, Marcus continued, his voice steady, low, and with a cold edge. You thought I wouldn't come back for what's mine? Jax's mind raced. He had underestimated Marcus. He had thought him nothing more than a man whose house they could easily destroy. He hadn't realized that in underestimating Marcus, they had unknowingly made a powerful enemy, one who wasn't done with them. The air around them grew heavier, the oppressive silence thickening. The gang was starting to realize just how wrong they were. One by one, they looked at each other with panic in their eyes. This was no longer a game. The man they had burned had become something else, a force they had no hope of controlling. With his every step, Marcus closed the gap between them. And as he did, the tension snapped. What they didn't know was that the last mistake they made wasn't lighting a match to Marcus's life. It was underestimating the kind of man who had learned to fight, not just to survive, but to make others regret crossing him. Now, they were about to find out what happens when you ignite a fire in a man who knows exactly how to put it out, his way. An hour passed. The night had thickened, the once seemingly peaceful atmosphere now suffocating with a heavy, oppressive silence. The fire flickered weakly, casting long, jittery shadows that danced along the walls of the alley. The air felt still, almost too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Yet, despite the eerie calm, the gang's unease had deepened, settling into the pit of their stomachs like a weight that couldn't be shrugged off. Jax, trying to maintain some semblance of control, checked his watch once more, the glowing numbers faintly visible in the dim light. His mind raced with thoughts of escape, of moving on to the next job. Nothing to worry about, he muttered under his breath, trying to convince himself more than anyone else. If the guy's still alive, he's probably halfway to the hospital by now. His voice held an edge of bravado, but the words felt hollow in his throat. He couldn't have been more wrong. The first sign of something being terribly amiss came without warning. Sanchez, one of the thugs who had been standing closest to the fire, was suddenly gone. One moment he was there, leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets, the next, nothing. No sound, no scream, no struggle. Just a sudden, eerie absence. At first, no one noticed. The fire crackled and popped, the shadows continuing their restless dance. It was only when the group shifted, when they began to speak among themselves, that the gap in their circle became apparent. "Where the hell's Sanchez?" one of them muttered, glancing around the dark alley. "He was just here a second ago." His voice held an edge of irritation, thinking perhaps Sanchez had wandered off to piss or was being lazy. But no one had seen him leave. The seconds stretched into uncomfortable silence, the only sound now the unsettling crackle of the fire. Another gang member, a heavyset man named Miller, fidgeted nervously, his eyes darting around. "What the hell's going on? That's not normal. He didn't just vanish." A ripple of unease moved through the group, their earlier bravado slowly slipping away like sand through their fingers. Jax clenched his jaw, trying to dismiss the growing suspicion that gnawed at him. "He'll turn up. Probably just getting high or something. Stay sharp, all right? No one's dead yet." He tried to sound confident, but even to his own ears, his words felt unconvincing. But the night, once seemingly indifferent, was closing in on them. Then it happened again. Another gang member, Marcos, was suddenly gone, vanished like a ghost. One moment he was leaning against the side of the building, looking bored, the next, nothing. No rustling, no shout. Just a void where he had been, leaving only the sound of the crackling fire and a cold sense of dread that continued to spread among the group. Now the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The fire's light, which once felt comforting, now seemed to make the shadows deeper, more menacing. The heat that had once felt welcoming now felt stifling, almost suffocating. "Where the hell is everyone going?" Jax demanded, a crack of panic seeping into his voice. He stood up abruptly, his earlier bravado crumbling. Marcos was just here. His eyes darted around the alley, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun holstered at his side. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The remaining members of the gang exchanged nervous glances, their fear now palpable. This wasn't normal. It wasn't just a random disappearance, this was calculated. And it was happening too fast, too quietly. Jax's heart raced as his mind scrambled for explanations. "Where is Sanchez?" he asked again, his voice a little more frantic now. "Damn it, where is he?" But there was no answer. The night seemed to grow heavier, the silence more profound. The firelight flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows across the narrow alleyway. The muffled sound of footsteps, light and deliberate, reached their ears, but from where? The gang members turned in every direction, trying to pinpoint the source, but it was impossible. The sound wasn't steady, it came in brief, sharp intervals, like a predator toying with its prey. That's when the reality of the situation hit them, all at once, with a terrifying clarity. They weren't just missing people. They weren't dealing with some random street thug. They were being hunted. The realization sunk into Jax like a stone, heavy and suffocating. His pulse thudded in his ears. They were being picked off, slowly, methodically, one by one. It wasn't a coincidence. This was planned. This was deliberate. His mind flashed back to the face in the shadows. Marcus. The man whose house they had burned down. The man they had underestimated. And now, it was clear, they weren't just dealing with someone who had lost everything. They were dealing with someone who was prepared to make them pay. Fear crawled up Jax's spine, taking root deep in his gut. The cocky, fearless leader, the man who had led this gang through countless schemes, was now paralyzed with terror. His fingers trembled around his gun, but it felt like a useless piece of metal in his hand. The creeping dread that had started as a whisper now roared in his chest. And then, without warning, another figure appeared at the end of the alley, standing just at the edge of the firelight. The gang members froze, their eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and terror. It was Marcus. His face, barely visible in the half-light, was cold, unreadable. His eyes were locked on Jax, his expression calculating and dangerous. Every inch of him radiated a kind of quiet menace that was more terrifying than any shouting or threats could ever be. "You should have stayed away." Marcus's voice was low, cold as steel, yet carried through the alley like a punch to the gut. The gang members flinched, their instincts screaming at them to run, but their legs refused to move. They were paralyzed with fear, each of them now realizing the magnitude of their mistake. Jax's voice came out weak, desperate. You were supposed to be dead. You burned my house," Marcus interrupted, his tone level but icy. And now, you're going to pay the price for it. One by one. The word sent a chill through Jax's entire body. The fear was no longer just a creeping sensation, it was an all-consuming force. His worst fear had come true. They weren't going to make it out of this. Not alive. And as Marcus stepped closer, his presence filling the alley like an impending storm, Jax knew deep down that it was already too late. The man they had tried to break had risen, and now they were the ones who were going to be broken. The leader of the gang, Jax, was now utterly alone in the alley. The night had swallowed him whole, and his crew was nothing more than shadows, scattered and gone without a trace. The sudden isolation was suffocating. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest tight as panic gripped him like a vice. His mind raced, trying to process the reality of the situation. They were being hunted, picked off one by one, and now, it was his turn. His hands shook violently as he fumbled for his phone, desperate for help, desperate to reach someone, anyone. His fingers slipped over the screen as he dialed, but each ring that echoed in his ear only deepened the void inside him. No one was answering. The world seemed to close in on him, the oppressive silence of the alley pressing down like a weight. He glanced around, eyes darting into the darkness. The shadows, which had once seemed so familiar, now felt foreign and suffocating. The temperature in the alley dropped, and with it, the dread that had been simmering since the first disappearance flared into full-blown terror. Jax's mind screamed for him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. Then, it came. That sound. Soft, steady footsteps, growing louder with each passing moment. Jax's heart raced. His chest tightened as if a steel band was tightening around it. His eyes locked on the shadows, trying to discern the figure approaching. But the darkness played tricks on him. He couldn't tell if it was the wind, his racing pulse, or something much more dangerous creeping closer. And then, he saw him. Emerging from the blackness like a ghost, moving with the deadly grace of a predator, was the man, the one he thought he'd broken. The one he had thought was finished. The man they had destroyed. But this time, the man didn't look like a victim anymore. He wasn't the shattered shell of a person Jax had expected to see. No. This man stood tall, strong, resolute, and the coldness in his eyes was unmistakable. His gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. His face was the calm before a storm. There was no trace of fear, no sign of defeat. He wasn't angry, he was something far more terrifying. He was calm. He was calculated. He was in control. Jax's breath caught in his throat, his grip tightening on the phone as if it could somehow save him. He took a step back, but the man's eyes never wavered. "I gave you a chance," the man's voice rang out, low and steady. It was a voice that carried weight, that held a quiet authority. It wasn't a shout, wasn't a scream, it was simply the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what was going to happen next. "You thought this was over," he continued, his voice almost gentle, like he was explaining a lesson to a child. "But it's not. Not yet." Jax's eyes widened in horror as he realized the gravity of what the man was saying. He wasn't running from this. This wasn't some vengeful outburst or a desperate act. No, the man had been waiting for this moment, the reckoning, and now it had arrived. Fear clutched at Jax's heart. His mind screamed at him to run, to fight back, to do something, but his body betrayed him. His legs were frozen, his movements sluggish and panicked. He could feel his own sweat trickling down his neck, his hands clammy and unsteady. His phone dropped to the ground with a soft clink, forgotten as his eyes locked onto the man who had once been his victim, and now was his executioner. He backed away, step by shaky step, but the man, Marcus, was already upon him. Swift. Silent. Like a shadow in the night, he closed the distance in an instant, his movements so fluid, so practiced, that Jax didn't even see him coming. One moment, there was space between them, and the next, Marcus was standing right in front of him, too close to escape, too close to hope for a reprieve. The air around them grew thick with the tension of what was about to unfold. Jax's pulse hammered in his ears, his hands trembling, his mind screaming for a way out. But there was no escape. He was cornered. The walls of the alley pressed in on him from all sides. Marcus's gaze was unwavering. His presence was suffocating, dominating the space around them. There was no room for negotiation, no room for mercy. There was only the cold inevitability of what Jax had set in motion. The Navy SEAL didn't flinch. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His eyes alone spoke volumes, promises of retribution, of justice, of a reckoning long overdue. He had given Jax a chance, a fleeting moment of grace, but that time had passed. The man who had once been broken was no longer the prey. He was the predator, and Jax had become the hunted. Jax's breath came in frantic bursts as his back hit the brick wall of the alley. He had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The reckoning had arrived. By the time the authorities arrived, the night had already sealed its deadly fate. The sirens wailed in the distance, a hollow sound that grew louder, but it was no match for the stillness that had descended on the alley. The gang's reign of terror was over, utterly and irrevocably cut short. The air was thick with the stench of smoke and blood, the remnants of a cruel and senseless war that had been waged, then ended without mercy. Scattered across the cold concrete were the lifeless bodies of Jax's crew, some sprawled out where they had fallen, others crumpled in unnatural positions, their final moments swallowed by the same dark shadows that had once shielded them. There was no hero's cry, no dramatic last stand. Only the aftermath. Only the silence of death. The authorities would find the destruction, the bloodshed, the horror. They would find the gang's twisted reign had come to an end, but they would find no answers to the question that hung in the air: who had done this? Where was the one man they had thought they had crushed, the one they had believed was broken? In the midst of the chaos, the Navy SEAL, the man who had been their intended victim, was gone. As quietly as he had come, as silently as he had picked them off one by one, he had vanished back into the shadows. There were no tracks to follow, no clues to uncover. The only thing left in his wake was the terror-stricken faces of the survivors and the cold, lifeless bodies of those who had been foolish enough to think they could break him. The authorities, when they finally arrived at the scene, could only piece together the carnage. Questions hung in the air like the smoke that still lingered from the flames. How had this happened? Who had orchestrated it? Why had no one heard anything? But the answers never came. The ones who had witnessed the man's wrath, the ones who had seen him in action, would carry the memories of that night for the rest of their lives. They would never forget the sight of him, of the man who had been pushed beyond the point of no return, beyond the breaking point. Those who survived, those who had lived to see the man standing tall in the darkness, would never forget the cold, calculating way he had hunted them. They had learned the hard way that when you destroy someone's life, when you push them to the edge, you better be prepared for the consequences. Because some people, when pushed far enough, don't just fight back, they dismantle you. They make you regret every decision you ever made, every wrong choice, every mistake. They don't just survive, they make sure you never forget the price of underestimating them. And Jax, the self-assured leader, the one who had thought himself untouchable, had learned that lesson too late. It was a lesson that would echo in the silence of the alley, in the forgotten corners of the city, and most of all, in the hearts of those who would carry the memory of that night until the end of their days. The gang's names would be forgotten by the world. Their reign of terror would become just another page in a history of forgotten crimes. But the lesson they left behind would endure. For the man they had tried to break wasn't just a victim, he was a force of reckoning. And those who had wronged him would never know peace again. That was the lesson Jax and his gang would carry with them to their graves. And for the rest of the world, it would be a quiet reminder. Some people, when pushed far enough, don't just break. They make sure you regret it. Forever.